correctly.
Okay, lovely. So if it's okay, I will take myself off the camera and let you get on with it, Kevin.
Yeah, I just need to do the share screen correctly. So
Okay. I've also got your presentation open if you need me to share. Oh, you
well,
got it.
hopefully,
You got it. Perfect.
yeah, I'll move it up the screen and find the button to say put it into view, which is there. There we go. I got there. Um, okay, so just a few little bits and pieces. I'm going to go through the role I play, a little bit about how the complaint system works. I'll give you some examples. Same with the ethics hotline. Then we'll have some questions if you've got any. So quite a simple run through. The so the regulatory consultant, the main role was always seen to be handling complaints about members under the code of conduct. It turns out that's not the main role because we don't get that many. But also I answer the calls to the ethics hotline, and we do get quite a number of those. I've been doing the job for about 2.5 years. I've had about 25, 30 calls to the ethics hotline compared to 3 complaints that have gone somewhere. So you can see that the balance is more on the hotline. I also handle anything raised under the bullying and harassment charter for staff and volunteers. So that's a recent addition to the role, but thankfully there's been nothing under that is worth mentioning. I report quarterly to the Professional Practices Committee. When I took on this role 2.5 years ago, I had previously been a chair of professional practices, and Andrew served on that committee with me. And I think Andrew would say we found it quite frustrating that the regulatory consultant at that time would just say, there's been 3 calls to the ethics hotline, and I'm handling 1 complaint that I can't tell you about. And we always felt that there was more learnings to be had, I think, from the calls. So when I took on the role, I said I would try to create more documentary evidence of the things we were handling whilst maintaining confidentiality. And I think that's been a successful move and has been appreciated not just by the members of the committee, but also by the CIPR staff involved, because we've had some guidance, and I can give you a very simple example. There was a call to the hotline from someone who'd been asked to edit a Wikipedia page for his client and wasn't quite sure what the ethical situation was on that. At that time, the CIPR was updating its guidance for handling for producing clients' Wikipedia pages. So we sent the draft guidance to the chap that was facing that issue at that very time, and he was able to give us some feedback for how our guidance reflected the real world that he was dealing with at that moment. The guidance was improved as a result. He got helped along the way, and I think there was a virtuous circle there for everyone involved. So that's a simple example of how we're trying to use the hotline to drive best practice guidance for staff, for members as well. So the complaint system, let's just tick off that. First contact can be phone. It's usually email. I go back to the complainant and say, well, that's all very good. You've made this complaint, but can I have some evidence, please? And I need to send you the rules for the complaint, which include making it confidential, that we don't talk about the case until it's over. And even then, we may not talk about it if the complaint was dismissed. If the evidence I receive is, in my view, substantive, I will then contact the member concerned. Usually, I send an email saying, can we have a phone call? And an email from me asking for a phone call usually gets a phone call quite quickly, because the member sees the title and thinks, oh, what's going on? At that stage, I share the evidence with the member and say, this is the accusation that's being made, this is the complaint. Do you have a response? We've now introduced a new step into the process because I did find on a couple of cases, well, I'd started the ball rolling. The member had a pretty good response that knocked down all of the evidence from the complainant, but I can't dismiss the complaint at that stage. I can try to mediate it, and I can try to get the parties to come to an agreement, and I'll talk you through a case where that happened, but I can't dismiss it. So we've now introduced a stage in the process where I, together with the two chairs of the professional standards panel, can review a case to decide whether it needs to go forward to a formal hearing or whether it can be dismissed at that stage. So it's like a case review to determine whether there is a case to answer. I can dismiss at the start if the evidence being put forward isn't substantive and isn't worthy of a reply. And I've done that a couple of times, where the evidence put forward has plainly been falsified and it's been spurious, and I can dismiss it at that stage. But if I decide there's something to answer, I can't then dismiss it based on the answer. So we put that step into the process to make sure that we don't go to the trouble of a hearing unless we have to. So what can happen if it goes to a hearing? A member can lose their membership. They can be expelled from the institute at the panel hearing. I can mediate and try and find a common ground. We can issue letters of advice or warning, but yeah, there's even a suspension of membership. So there's a number of things that can happen. So let me talk you through just a couple of anonymous complaints. This one began with the complainant saying the consultant had lied to them about coverage. They promised things, were going to appear. In particular, there was an article, an interview to appear in a regional newspaper. The 3 months down the line, this hadn't appeared, and the client concerned had contacted the regional newspaper, who said they knew nothing about it. So this was obviously the consultant was lying. The evidence produced to me included emails with the consultant saying, yes, this is going to appear in this paper, and then the email from the paper saying, we don't know, from the features editor saying, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't have such a column as described. When I put it back to the consultants, they were able to respond very strongly. And they sent the email from the magazine section of the regional newspaper, apologizing that they hadn't carried the piece yet, but saying they would be carrying it in, shortly. And other elements of the case were the client saying, you're claiming coverage that we did, not you. And the consultant saying, all I'm doing is reporting on the coverage. I'm giving you a coverage report, and yes, it includes things that you placed, but I'm not saying they're just placed by me. I'm saying this is the coverage that's appeared. And really, as is often the case, the heart of this issue was money. And the client didn't think they'd got value for money. And the consultant at that stage also was owed 2 months, or might have even been 3 months, of fee that hadn't been paid. the consultant was about to take the complainant to the small claims court to try to get their money back, and they'd really run out of patience with a client they described as a bully. I reached the conclusion that the client was actually starting a professional practices complaint to throw some mud into the air and hopefully get a finding against the consultant that they could then use to defend the small claims court. I spent probably 2 months back and forth between the two parties before finally reaching an agreement where effectively half the owing fees were paid. The complaint against the client was the small claims court case was dropped, and the professional practices complaint was dropped. I don't think either party was happy with the outcome, but both of them realised they had lives to get on with, and this was the way out of it. But it did take a couple of months. Previous regulatory consultants have said to me that 75% of the complaints they get actually boil down to money. I haven't found that, but this one certainly was. I don't know if anyone has any questions on that, so to make this a bit more interactive. If not, I'll move on. I can't see if anyone's got their hand up. So the next one is one where we are trying to take some best practice lessons from. A journalist was targeted with what was a completely irrelevant news story. The consultant regarded it as a picture story. The journalist thought it was a picture with two sides of A4 of text. It was a story about a utility company around Pancake Day. It was very much a consumer story. The journalist concerned was a travel correspondent and a travel photography expert. He felt that he shouldn't have got this story, and that the consultant had therefore broken GDPR regulations and had no right to target him. The fact of the matter is he was listed on the Cision database under the picture desk heading. He's patently not a picture desk, but he got the release because the consultant had ticked the box saying, I want this to go to picture editors. His profile, if you searched it, was very clear that he was only interested in travel stories. So he felt that this was mistargeting and didn't accept the fact that he ticked some, that he'd obviously at some stage ticked picture desk box, but he did appear on that list. There's no breach of GDPR because it's Cision that have that responsibility, and you have those journalists have given the right to Cision to make their names available under these circumstances. So there's no GDPR breach at all. But I think there is a lesson to be learned about just how broadly you're targeting a piece of work, and that maybe I think there were 863 names on the picture desk list, and I think it was a very industry specific story, or maybe a tabloid story, and I think the targeting was ill conceived, and it's the sort of thing that gets us a bad reputation. And I've been following on Twitter some complaints going on at the moment between journalists and people receiving material that's not relevant to them. So I think there are some lessons to learn about how tools like Cision are used. I suspect in some cases, when it's first sold into an agency, someone gets trained and then they move on and they train the person that's replaced them, and that person trains the person that's replaced them, and it all gets a little bit watered down. And I do think that as a profession, we benefit from better targeting of our material rather than taking a blunderbuss approach. So we are trying to contact Cision to talk about whether we can carry something in Influence magazine or issue new best practice guidance on using tools like that to make sure that people target their material slightly more accurately. But that's a complaint that went nowhere, other than as learning. If we move on to the ethics hotline, 9 times out of 10, the people calling the ethics hotline are independent practitioners. They've got no one else to talk to. They haven't got a colleague in PR they can turn to and discuss the situation with. They're usually not so much ethical as guidance around sort of decision making and best practice. What should I do here? But they want to respect the code of conduct, and the code of conduct talks about honesty and transparency in all of your dealings. They want reassurance and advice that what they are doing is respecting the code of conduct, and that the approach they should take would be the right one. And again, these calls highlight the need for member guidance. I haven't reported on this one to professional practices yet, but I've been dealing last week with a guy working in-house over a subject access request that had come in. It's a local authority case. There's a dispute with a resident, let's say, and that resident has submitted a subject access request into the data team at the local authority, and the data team have provided everything, and they've provided everything completely unredacted. Within that, there are all sorts of bits of correspondence between the press officer and the chief executive with what might be termed banter about said resident within it, that is now likely to come back and bite the chief executive and the press officer on the backside, because it's all how do we handle this media complaint from this person. The member was asking me what is our guidance to members for how you handle the subject access request, and what information can you redact, and how you move forward. We don't actually have anything on the member website on that topic. We do have some knowledge, and I have dealt with some, and I think it's an area where we are going to need to provide members with some guidance. The first thing that press officer needed to do was to say to the data protection data team in the council, why on earth are you responding to this without checking with the PR team? Because it's the response that is at fault there, because some of that material could have been redacted under a subject access request. So that's a great example just from last week of how these calls can highlight what we need to provide to help our members. But I'll give you a couple of examples of slightly older calls. This is this substance or is it spin? So the client asked the practitioner to write both internal and external comms. It was about a change in the senior leadership team. That person, that executive, was leaving the business very suddenly. Our practitioner thought, I don't know everything here. I've not got the full background. She actually said to me, this smells fishy. Something's odd. I don't know what's going on. I don't think I'm being told the truth. I've been given some material to work with, and I'm not sure it's the full story. She wanted to say, I'm not going to do it. It's against the code of conduct to knowingly mislead. But then she said, the trouble is, I don't know if it's untrue. I may have been given the full story. It's my biggest client. They're really important to me, and I'm worried that if I say I'm not going to do this, it could affect my business. And then she said, am I breaking the code if I don't know I'm misleading? if I think I'm telling the truth, am I breaking the code? And I said, well, you've already told me you think you're likely not telling the truth. So if something smells fishy and sounds fishy, it probably is fishy. So what is your route out of this conundrum? Any thoughts online? What advice should I have given?
Well, I
You
suppose
remember
it's
this, Andrew?
sorry, yeah. It's just a question, I suppose, of knowing what the truth is. I mean, if a client assures you that this is the truth, then I think it's reasonable to reflect that, unless you actually know otherwise. I mean, there's a difference between feeling and knowing.
Yeah.
I just saw something.
So,
Well, can I just?
Yeah.
I think that we have to remember is as well at senior levels, it can happen that somebody goes quite quickly because that's what the board has decided, or for the markets or whatever. It has to move quickly.
Yeah.
And I think there's also if that person was being told to, I think it depends on the material. What you've written, I think is we can take it either way. But if the material said, "Oh, this person has been fantastic and they've done this and this," when you didn't know that, that's when it starts to get a bit. So when you're saying about the spin, what was the message the practitioner was actually being asked to give? Was it, we've been very thankful for this individual service, that's now time to move on to something else. Here's the new person. Then you focus on the new person, not the old person, don't you? And you just move along. So I think it is one of these, this is where the whole fun of ethics comes in, isn't it? And it's not necessarily just going with your gut, but calling the hotline and getting the help and support to be able to talk through these issues.
Yeah. So what I said to someone else?
Yeah, I was just going to chip in, if I may. I had almost exactly this situation earlier in the year where I was working for someone who was involved in a very high-profile acquisition, and a lot of journalists started doing some digging and presuming that certain things were not true that he was claiming, or that had been suggested that he had less money than he'd got, etc., etc. And they started running a significant number of stories doubting the truth in what was being claimed about him. And he said, look, here's a statement, send it out. And I was in exactly this situation, and I said to him, look, I can't send this out unless I've got fundamental proof. I'm not going to put my name to something or back something unless I've got full proof that what you are claiming is the truth. And so I didn't run it. He ended up paying someone separate to run it on PR Newswire, denying all the claims that the journalists had made. And then further down the line, kept me on, but further down the line hired another agency with someone who isn't, I don't think, a member of the CIPR or any other governing body, who just did exactly what they were told. And I resigned. So I think you do have to. I think just because and I get what you say about not necessarily just working on instinct, but I think if something does feel uncomfortable, you've got to get some categorical proof rather than just take the word of someone who you've been working with, who you might want to trust. Because when it does get a bit tricky, people can be a bit desperate and stretch things, and dare I say it, spin things in a way that we don't really want to be associated with.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Anyone else?
I think if I could just add to it, from a kind of client side, there could also be situations, I guess, where there are legal implications or legal involvement, and there is not much more that can be said. And I've certainly come across examples of those before, which obviously is not, it makes it harder for practitioners if the client is not able to give the full story as well.
Yeah. So I couldn't actually see who was speaking, but so the advice. Oh, I've gone on a slide. Sorry, let's go back. How do I go back? There we no. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. The advice I gave on this one was not to refuse to do the work, but to go back to the client and say, actually, I can't do the work. I can't do the work unless you tell me the full story, because I can't prepare the best internal announcement, the best external announcement, and the best Q&A to handle the situation unless I know it all. And I've got an NDA with you, so tell me everything, and then I can tell you the best way to handle this. And you appreciate there may be something that you need to keep quiet. The guy may have an illness. He may be leaving because he's been at a terminal. He doesn't want anyone to know. You can be told the reasons, and you can agree to respect some confidentiality, but you can't do the job properly unless you have all the facts and information. So it isn't, don't go back to them and say, I'm not doing this. Go back to them and say, I can't actually do this for you. I can't do a good job for you unless you tell me this. And that's the way it moved forward. And I believe that I had a little note from the member concerned saying thank you, and everything's been resolved. So it's a question of thinking about the language and how you respond to that situation, rather than just saying, no, I can't do it. Let's see if we can move forward now. So this is an interesting one. And we ended up calling this residual responsibility. So our member had done some work for a publishing company promoting quite a young author who was going to have the first books published on World Book Day. So the member was employed by the publishing company, but was working with the mother and the young author. The very short campaign, it was not around World Book Day, it was in advance of that. And she was asked to do something with the publishing media and a little bit of local work, and that's what she did. All completed, all very happy, everyone happy with what had gone on. And then, because of some of the local media coverage, it got picked up a bit more, it got picked up regionally. A tabloid began to become interested, and Black Lives Matter charity wanted the child to be a sort of poster boy for how someone in an inner city urban environment can thrive and succeed, and all this sort of stuff. A radio crew went to the school, and the mother was no longer involving the practitioner, whose contract was in any case over and done with. But the practitioner felt, this is out of control. There's a child safeguarding issue here. This is a very young child. There's possible bullying implications if this child is shown out to be sort of special at the school. And we're talking primary school age. And she was feeling, it's nothing to do with me anymore. I'm not involved. I'm not retained. But I set this ball in motion. What on earth should I do now? And I think this concept of residual responsibility for what happens to a campaign after you've stopped working on it is quite interesting. Any thoughts on this? It's a different one, isn't it? I think someone was talking and I couldn't hear. Are you muted? No. Okay.
So Kevin, it's Rachel again. I just think you've got a fantastic example that the whole thing about residual responsibility, when we start to think about it, is terrifying.
Yeah.
But I think the way in which this example, obviously it's a real example, done as a child safeguarding, it narrows it down a little bit. But yeah, it's yeah, that poor individual.
Yeah,
Got to feel for that individual, but ultimately, I'm guessing her contract or their contract was with the publisher.
yeah.
The
Her contract
publisher
was
and the parent should therefore have been concerned about the safeguarding.
yeah.
And in actual fact, you think it's one of those situations where they'd have been damned if they did and damned if they didn't, because if they'd not got the degree of coverage, they'd have had a really miserable client.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things about this was this person called me because she raised the matter with a lecturer. She was still going through. I think she was not the diploma. She was doing the diploma. She raised it with her lecturer, who said to call the hotline. So I was pleased that the hotline was at least known in those circles as well. And I said to her that obviously she's not engaged on, it's not her project anymore, but that she ought to put her concerns in writing, both to the publisher and to the mother, and to say, there will be time. World Book Day was 3 months away at the time. There will be time to do this again. The publisher had spoken to her about, we might get you back involved again on World Book Day, but she was fallow at that stage. And I said, you should put your concerns in writing, say, it's time to take a pause, take a deep breath, don't do anything now, and also don't do anything without some support and guidance alongside you, without a professional managing the situation. When I did this sort of session with the professional standards panel, some of the lay members of that were concerned that in doing that, it looked like the practitioner was pitching for more business. So, that really is damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I felt it was important that she wrote her concerns and said, stop and then start again, but handle it properly with professional support alongside you. And she'd said that both to her client, who was the publisher, but also to the mother. But yeah, and that is, again, so some of these that I've been talking you through and others, we're now in the process for Members Week of putting them into a little ethics pack that people can read and access to gain their 5 CPD points for the year. So in each of them, there'll be this was the issue, this is what was said. And I wait for people to come back and tell me I've been doing a shocking job when they start to read the my advice is there for all concerned to read forever and a day. But anyway, I think that was an interesting one. I'm not sure what we can do in terms of best practice advice to anyone, but if you've got concerns about what's going to happen afterwards, I think you should put them in writing.
Kevin, if I can interject.
Yeah.
I'd have thought a really key factor in this case was whether or not the whole safeguarding issue got raised in the first place, whether that was factored in to the project.
I don't know that, Ruth.
Now, with regards responsibility for that, I would have said that was with the publisher. But ideally, a seasoned PR practitioner would raise that as a flag in the planning stage of a project like this. And it should be a fairly obvious thing to flag. So it might not be your responsibility. I would say that is the publisher in this case, but ideally in the planning, it's sort of helping your client to kind of think through the likely consequence of media coverage, that this had a high probability of attracting the eye of the national media. And really, in a way, I mean, obviously, once it gets national, it just accelerates the impact. But the principle applies whatever level of coverage. You're talking about public coverage for a child. So that's immediately a safeguarding issue that should have immediately involved the school and protection measures put in place. So I know that's slightly like, after the horse is bolted, but
you're right, Ruth. And didn't ask that question at the time, so but I would hope that happened. But what I can say to you is when I took the call, standing outside Waitrose in Bath, because I can't choose when the when the phone call comes in, and when the practitioner told me the story and what was happening, I went, "Wow, really? That'll get the nationals." And she said, "Yeah, that's the problem."
Yeah, yeah, it should have been a fairly obvious, but I mean that's slightly kind of, you know, crying over spilt milk and perhaps not. Yeah, I mean obviously you've got to deal with the consequence of the aftermath, but I would say, I mean, I take on board the critique or the concern about. I mean, from what you said, you know, that wasn't the practitioner's intention at all to be pitching for business, but I get that as a valid concern being raised. But I would say, I mean, I certainly would feel duty bound to put something in writing in that scenario.
She
think,
had
yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
project commissions from the publishing company, and they'd
Yeah.
already said to her, "Yeah, we'll do it." So she wasn't pitching for it because
no, there was
she
that
did it.
precedent set. Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it could be seen as trying to increase the scope of her project. Certainly.
Interesting.
Right. I think
I
this.
think that's sorry, just thinking about the
Yeah.
best practice there going forward. I think it starts to raise that issue that we talk about a lot, about bringing us into conversations sooner.
Yeah.
Because the ultimate landscape is where we know. So you want to know every risk, every opportunity. The opportunity is the easy bit, but we need to tell you about the risks. And if you just bring us in saying do that, that's when you can start to have some of the problems, because have you considered this, and this? To Ruth's point, you know, safeguarding should have been considered at the outset when you're dealing with a child. That and in this instance, particularly in the world in which we live. But I think that's another thing about educating our clients, being the expert and subject matter, the professional. Have you considered all these additional things? Not just, are you going to get decent coverage?
Yeah. This is the last one, and I'm using this as a segue to something that Hayley asked me to talk about as well. This is quite simple. The client was giving the practitioner imagery, photos, graphics, and 9 times out of 10 wasn't clear about the source of that material. The practitioner was saying, "I can't use that unless I can accredit it. I don't know who owns the copyright to that." And it was causing a conflict. You know, we've always done this. It's never caused us any problems. Stop being so fussy. Sometimes that imagery, it was an IT company, was coming from resellers of the IT product, and the practitioner said, "Can I call the reseller that's giving you that and ask them where they got it from? Because it looks like a library photo, and I don't know what the." "Oh no, you don't. They've given it to us. It's fine. It's fine." And basically, it was becoming a situation of conflict between the client and the practitioner. And she felt that the more she pushed back, the more likely she was to lose the business. And she didn't want to lose the business because it was big and important. And, you know, what should she do? She tried sending the client some examples of the BBC properly accrediting photos that they'd got. But it wasn't really sinking home. Now, I won't ask you what you think because it's quite obvious that you can't use imagery that you don't know where it's come from. I said to her that what she had to do was have the discussion not at a time of conflict, not at a time when the issue was hot, but to do that good old-fashioned thing of taking the client out to lunch and explaining that actually you're breaking the law and this is copyright law. You're breaking it. I'm protecting you by saying don't do this. And rather than show an example on the BBC site, which obviously is viewed by millions and millions of people, and a small company in South Africa, as it turns out, is not going to regard themselves as similar to the BBC, but show them some examples from a LinkedIn page of a small company acting properly and acting in the right way. And the reason I'm doing this one last, I don't think it's particularly interesting from this point of view, and I don't think anyone's going to disagree with the you can't do that, is that Hayley's asked me to talk about AI and ethics as well. And in about 2 weeks' time, I'm facilitating a session with all the CIPR trainers on AI and ethics. And one of the things that comes to mind, and how this is very similar to it, is if you use AI for some research and you get a whole bunch of material back, you don't know where it's come from. You don't know the provenance of that material, and yet people are using it. So this is a real simple old world in some ways example of how we need to use AI ethically within the code of conduct. And it isn't that you put at the end of an article, this was written with the help of AI, because you wouldn't put at the end of an article, this was written with the help of a Google search. But if you'd done a Google search and found some material, you would know that that instance you're quoting from is from the FT, or it's from Deloitte or another reputable firm of, you'd know and have some feeling for the credibility of the material you've received and that you've based your article on, or you've based a pitch around, or whatever it may be. If you just use AI to tell you some answers for a question, you don't necessarily know where that information is being drawn from and the credibility of that source. It's a link to digital imagery, but I think it's a real world example that says we have to quote our sources, and AI maybe isn't a source, it's where it's getting it from. Very interestingly, in putting the session together for the trainers, we came up with 4 headings that we wanted the discussion just to feature around, and then we used ChatGPT to say, given these topics on AI and ethics, what questions would you ask? And we've got the questions to ask ourselves using AI to come up with the questions for the session, which I think is quite neat. But we're asking questions there, and we don't need to know the source for those questions. But if you start using AI to give you some facts or some evidence to back up what you want to talk about, you definitely need to know where it's come from. So that is, I believe, my 45 minutes. And the next slide, I hope, says, oh, for God's sake, questions. Yeah, clean bill of health so far.
Everybody trawling through their photo library. Just
yeah.
I just want a bit what you said there, that you took it from a client perspective. I've had that challenge a couple of times in-house.
Yeah.
It's when you enroll and you inherit somebody else's stuff, and you've got your internal client saying, just use that image. And the new person in, where's it from? Oh, it's in the photo library. Okay. Where's it from?
Yeah. Yeah.
How frequently have you been using it? We need a different one. And that's a challenge in so many places. And interesting what you were saying about ChatGPT there as well, is that you don't know where it's getting it from. You also don't know if it's not just making it up itself anyway.
Yeah, well, there's that case going through in America at the moment, isn't it? You're probably aware of, yeah, where a lawyer has cited case evidence in a case in a court. It turned out to be fictitious case evidence, and now the 2 lawyers now facing being disbarred.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought that really no one wants to hear this because it's more work, but you have a duty of care to cross-check your references.
Yeah.
You just have to. You have to take that material that AI served you, and then you've got to go do your own cross-referencing on Google search to work out where it's from. And why wouldn't you do that? Your reputation's at risk.
Yeah.
Case in point, that referring to that example you've just cited. Yeah, it's just too big a risk. And yeah, and I would second what Rachel's just said as well. It's just such a common, sadly, all too common scenario with images, and it's sometimes it's just from a position of ignorance as well. I mean, I've also experienced it in-house, where basic like copyright licenses not being in place, that kind of thing. And it's not because anyone's deliberately trying to not do the right thing. It's just been through a complete lack of understanding of what's needed. And I think that's probably the key generally. I mean, I appreciate it must be a lot. I have the advantage of being in-house, although I have had a spell as a freelance, and obviously it's different when you've got clients, because it's a different dynamic. And your salary is dependent on keeping your clients happy. It's a slightly different thing. But I find a common component in all these scenarios is a kind of emotional kind of tension, friction point that can arise because you're being asked to do one thing and you say, well, actually no. And my experience is that the way forwards is, as you've indicated, just to be very, very clear about the facts. And quite often there is a legal component to the situation. And once you carefully and clearly explain, well, actually part of what you're paying me for is to protect your reputation. And that includes making sure that you're not putting yourself at risk. And actually this situation puts you at risk for these reasons.
Yeah.
Whether that's a copyright breach, whether it's a safeguarding issue, going back to that other example, whatever it might be, then suddenly that takes the sting out of the tail a little bit. You sort of move away from emotion to just hard, clear facts, like backed up with a few key points, and that could be the way forward. And it's where the rubber hits the road for us, I think, as serious practitioners. If we're really going to be working to charter standards, working professionally, we have to be so much more than just yes men that just do what we're told, even if that does make us unpopular sometimes. We just have to do that. I've been in that position. I'm sure many people on this call have been in that position. I literally had a fight. I was reporting directly to one scenario, I was reporting directly to the top, and I was asked to do something that I felt was ethically compromising. I said no. The other person said, yes, you will. I said, no. The other person said, yes, you will. And I was like, when I sat there at my desk, I went back and I said, I'm sorry, I just can't do this. And it was not a happy day. I went home that night thinking, have I got a job in the morning? And actually the next day there was a climb down and the person said to me, I am sorry. I apologize. I've reflected. You were right. Thank you for standing your ground. And needless to say, after that, our relationship took a nice positive step forwards. It wasn't a comfortable moment. But I think we have to be realistic as practitioners. If we're going to be recognised and valued, it's these kind of really tricky, uncomfortable situations where our mettle is tested and where, we have the potential to show our worth, to show our value. It's in these moments that we can really make a difference. Those of us who just, it's not always easy. And if we're not experienced or confident, we can fall over. But that's why I'm so grateful that there is this hotline. And, perhaps also the wider message is that, those of us who are more senior and experienced need to let others know, look, we're here, we're available. Reach out to someone. If you're not sure, reach out. If in doubt, go and consult with someone, please. Call the ethics hotline, call me, call Rachel, call any one of our esteemed colleagues on this call who are, who've got, many years experience, more years than we care to consider, because there's our own personal reputation, but there's also our industry reputation at risk, and on what we're trying to deliver and change in terms of how we're perceived. If we don't start acting like the big people in the room, then we're not going to be treated like that. Anyway, sorry. Slightly soapboxing there, but I just get a bit passionate about these things.
Any other questions elsewhere? You might have a lunch break before you get the rest of your session done. Do you? Or are you a workhorse? Going to drive them hard, Hayley? Are you?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, no, I think if everybody is happy, should we take a sort of 10-minute break before I start the meeting? Yeah, is that okay? Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks, Kevin.
It's been really useful.
Thank
All
you very
right.
much.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.
Bye bye.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.